Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery preparing to check in on this bin of red wigglers. Red wigglers that were recruited from outside. Originally they were recruited from my compost barrel, which is a system that I've never populated with worms. The worms just sort of self-populated into that system, and there's lots of them in there. And because there's lots of worms living in my compost barrel, that's the place that I usually go to recruit worms for my outdoor worm bag. And when the outdoor worm bag had come to the point where it was time to harvest the castings and move the worms on, the system was brought indoors, given a chance to dry off, and then harvested as usual. And then the worms were kind of kept indoors. So these are recent transplants from being outdoor worms in my compost barrel to being transferred into my managed outdoor worm bag, and then eventually getting removed from the outdoor worm bag and used to launch off this bus bin. So these are now officially indoor worms. And the reason I was going a little bit slow is because we've seen slugs in this system. Pulling them out each time we've observed them, but I've always assumed that we would continue to see them. I mean, I even came prepared with a material that some viewers had suggested might work to eradicate slugs. I had some diatomaceous earth on standby, thinking that we might be able to apply some of it onto them if we observed any. But I don't see any, which is great. So perhaps removing them manually on each occasion has worked. So in this system, we decided a few feedings ago, 2 feedings ago actually, to start doing this corner feeding, pocket feeding. And this feeding zone indicator was in the corner because this was the second out of 4 feedings. So out of the 4 feedings that the system has received over its 8 weeks in service, the last 2 were pocket feedings. Number 1 went here, and the last one went here. So the next feeding is going to be positioned here. We're going to continue going clockwise, and before we open up the pocket into which we're going to feed today, I always like to explore to see how the past feeding had done. So why don't we just move our feeding zone indicator temporarily over to the corner where we plan to feed, but we can backtrack a little bit here. We can go back to the corner that was fed last, which was 2 weeks ago at this point, 14 days ago, and I don't remember exactly what was fed, but if we run into leftovers, that'll certainly serve as a clue. I see a chunk of lime, but it is coming back to me now because I see some of the peels of the potato that were put in here. Potato peel was the majority of the feeding because there was a good pile of it. And then here I believe we're seeing the leftovers of some bread type pastries, these little biscuits that were put in here. 3 of them were put in here. I'm fairly certain that there had been a banana peel as well. So this might just be more of that pastry. We might encounter a third jumble of similar material, and there it is. There were 3 of them put in here. I think in other worm bin feedings we've observed that stuff getting consumed quite rapidly. So for whatever reason it's showing up as leftovers here. This is a banana peel, holding up quite good also, kind of begging the question why. Because when I did breeze through the video from the last feeding, before putting the feeding in here, we similarly explored the previous feeding. So 14 days go back to the last time we fed here, but there was 12 days that had lapsed even prior. So 12 and 14 gets us to 26 days. Here's a second banana peel. So it does seem like they were given 2 banana peels to nibble on last time. I'm smelling this kind of fermenting odor in here. And offhand, it doesn't really stand out in my nose or in my mind what it is that we're sensing the smell of, or what I'm sensing the smell of. Obviously, you're not sensing the smell of anything as the viewer, unless, of course, you're watching me on a smell-o-vision, which most people probably don't have. And besides, I'm not broadcasting in smell-o-vision format anyway. All right, I'm being a little bit silly, but it was kind of interesting to pour through this feeding zone and find so many leftovers. A little bit of an unexpected outcome, considering we've given them 14 days to work down the foods they got. The few peels of potato that I encountered do all seem stripped clean of any potato that might have been left on them. All I'm seeing is the very thin outer skin of the potato. Any of the meaty potato that might have been stuck to the potato peel is, at this point, history, which is usually the case. They go after what they can eat quickly, and with potato, they chew off the nice, soft, meaty part of the potato, or the soft, fleshy part of it. But then they usually leave the skin for later. It seems to be a more resistant material to break down, which kind of makes sense, right? Since potatoes grow underground, if the outer skin were also a material that had a tendency to break down quickly, the potatoes wouldn't stand a chance being underground. So I think perhaps the skin of potato is a material which, by its nature, is a little bit resistant to breakdown. I do sometimes encounter certain foods that are rather resistant to breakdown. But it does seem to me like freezing stuff often does aid to speed up the breakdown process somehow. Perhaps just the freezing process and the crystallization of the materials helps. Now, here, perhaps the reason we're not seeing much of a turnout over in the last feeding zone is because the stuff we gave them 2 feedings ago is still in progress. And this was pretty much what we saw last time too when we came in here. They were definitely enjoying whatever it is that was fed in this feeding zone 2 feedings ago, almost 4 weeks ago. So, with all this fun occurring over in these 2 corners, it kind of makes me wonder what we're going to see on the opposite end of the bin when we get to excavating a space to put today's feeding into. Today's feeding is going to, oh, by the way, you might have seen some more of this starchy bread-like material over here, which probably suggests that we fed something similar over there too, and that's a big part of what they're getting today. I've got this massive piece of very moldy bread, and it was getting so moldy that I figured I would try to slow down the progress of the mold by freezing it. So this came out of my freezer, as did these few leaves of cabbage. So that was going to be their feeding today. Let's just continue in a clockwise pattern to just quickly check out this corner over here, which I would expect very little activity in. Here and there I'm bumping into old leftovers that must have come with the worms from the outdoor worm bag that these worms occupied in their previous home. And I also bumped into a couple chunks of corn cob. So a lot of times when I try to bring a system to an end and there are leftovers, the leftovers accompany the worms into their new home. So that's the reason we're seeing a couple of those slower composting objects. And I'm assuming that when we open up this corner here to feed, we're going to see a similarly sparsely occupied place. And there's a couple worms hanging out in this stuff, but certainly not many. Here's another chunk of corn cob. So I figured I would open up a pretty good size hole because that piece of moldy bread is fairly large. Another piece of corn cob, or perhaps the same piece. And you know, as bedding, I was wondering about that cardboard material that was draped out across the top. I mean, good portions of this seem like they're already tearing away from the main piece. There are just little fragments here and there. I suppose if we wanted to drape this out again across the top surface, we could, but it doesn't really serve any sort of a real purpose. Perhaps it's better used down here as a foundational layer of material onto which we could start stacking in today's feeding. So why don't we do that? We'll just make use of this cardboard to be in a somewhat more productive role at this point. Down here in the feeding zone, this cabbage is still a little bit frosty and still kind of holding together because it's not yet fully thawed out yet. And this piece of bread, I attempted to soak it for a little while before starting into the feeding here to see if it might aid in the softening of the material, because like most bread that's been sitting around for a while, this stuff is rather hard, and there's a good bit of it here. But I think we've managed to fragment it into a couple chunks, and I do wonder if perhaps we might be giving this stuff a better chance at getting consumed if it is sort of not there in a huge pile. I mean, it is there in a pretty good sized pile, but it's not like I just threw the entire chunk of bread in there as is. I did attempt to break it up into little pieces, but I figured maybe we can make it a little bit more appealing to the worms and perhaps a little bit more interesting for them to come at it if we were to surround it with some bedding materials, place it on top of the cabbage, and I've still got a few chunks of cabbage that we can rest right on top of it too. When I do these feedings, my aim is not to have leftovers to observe later. It's more about having very little leftovers and hopefully a whole bunch of satisfied worms that have eaten the stuff. And I figured perhaps if we just sprinkle the stuff with some grit, the worms definitely do seem to enjoy coming out for the grit. In my case, the grit I'm using is pulverized eggshell, so perhaps we're further sweetening the deal for these little guys by covering the bread with a whole bunch of crushed eggshell. So they'll come by, nip off the grit, which they definitely seem to enjoy in most cases, and then perhaps they'll help us do away with some of that moldy bread. Well, you know, not to mention the fact that the mold growing on that bread is also something that the worms tend to like a lot. So those biscuits that I've been feeding, the ones that we saw leftovers of over in the other feeding zones, were put in here without any mold growing on them, none that I was aware of. So perhaps the added twist here of having a good bit of mold growing on this stuff will also aid in the more speedy consumption of the starchy, delicious food items. So we've come to the end of today's check-in. We no longer have a cardboard top covering, but we still have a newspaper top covering. That went in here brand new last check-in. And the feeding zone indicator went in here brand new last check-in too. But both are holding up quite nicely. And I must say I'm really pleased to see no slugs. I mean, perhaps there are some and I just missed them. But I'd like to think that perhaps with a little bit of effort, by simply plucking them out whenever I notice them, perhaps we've actually done away with them. And if that's the case, then that's a nice happy ending to the story. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.